This is a presentation with Seth Klein, the director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. And he presented a paper towards a more democratic, busy budget. So, Seth, can you tell us a little bit about this $3.4 billion surplus budget?
Yeah. Well, Mark Lee, our economist, and I went in front of the Provincial Finance Committee a couple of weeks ago. Was it a month ago now? Every fall, the Provincial Legislature's Finance Committee tours around the province and asks British Columbians for their input on basically what should change in the budget, but in particular, what should be done with the surplus. We generally go and submit a budget brief, but in our budget brief this year, we were particularly wanting to emphasize the fact that the numbers that they're asking for input on aren't credible. Because they take a lot of time touring around the province, and they ask British Columbians to come out and give their opinion. A flyer goes to every household in the province asking people for their opinion, but it's all based on a surplus that is a fiction, because the figure that they float as what the surplus will be next year and the year after is a tiny fraction of what it will actually be. And this is the game that the finance minister likes to play, where they say they're going to have a very small surplus, but when you look at the numbers, it's clearly not going to happen. And so we went to say, look, this is crazy, it's got to stop.
Yep. They say it doesn't matter how much it is, because what we do with it is what counts, and we paid down the debt.
Well, the finance minister likes to say that, and we counter that, in fact, there are many better things you could do with it than pay down the debt, that we have more pressing social and environmental needs. But you see, that's not actually the case when, in terms of the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee goes out and solicits opinion about how much should go towards the debt, how much should go towards tax cuts, how much should go towards spending. And British Columbians, when they give feedback to that committee, overwhelmingly say that their priority is on the spending side. But what ends up happening is when they end up having these huge and completely predictable surpluses, the work of the Finance Committee is being trumped by a de facto policy which puts the priority on debt reduction, which is not what the committee is being told.
And tax cuts.
They say last year, tax cuts was a huge one.
We eliminated provincial income taxes for everyone earning under $15,500. That's helping seniors and renters on fixed incomes. People used to start paying income taxes at $10,000. So that's a pretty significant first step. We reduced provincial income taxes for people earning $30,000 a year or less by 37%. And 63% reduction was put in place for people under $20,000. So today, a typical senior couple earning $30,000 a year pays over $1,000 less for income tax alone.
Yeah, so if we have so much surplus, maybe we should cut taxes. Now, just briefly, can you clarify this for people? Because a lot of people say, yeah, I want my taxes cut. Isn't it better for us not to have to pay so much to the government?
Again, that's not what people are telling the Finance Committee. When the Finance Committee surveys the public, and when people send in their questionnaire that gets circulated to households, the overwhelming priority that they are being told is that people want to see the money put into public services and pressing social needs. So our point to the committee is, look, we can have a legitimate debate like you're asking, whether or not we should put it into tax cuts. We think that's not a good use. Whether it should go into debt reduction. But we should have the debate about a number that's not a fiction.
And everyone in BC earning up to $80,000 a year now has the lowest income tax rates in Canada.
Why is tax cuts not good for the people in general?
Well, first of all, let me reiterate that I don't hear people really clamoring for it. I mean, last year's provincial budget, where Carol Taylor brought in $1.5 billion in tax cuts, was a real shocker to me for the simple fact that, having read the Finance Committee's report, it just seemed to come out of nowhere. Nobody was asking for this, other than a few extreme, right-wing elements and groups out there. But mostly, it's simply not needed. We have among the lowest taxes in the country as it is. And when you stand back and say, well, what are the economy's doing well, the unemployment rate is low, and so you stand back and you say, what's the priority here? Do we need more tax cuts for people who are already doing very well, thank you very much, in a society that already has the most inequality in the country? Or should we be focusing on poverty and childcare and all of the areas that are much more urgent?
But the popular myth is we cut taxes, vote for me. And somehow that works. That's why we have the government that we have, isn't it? So I wonder why is that we as a society don't quite understand the benefits of taxes, or is that we're extremely selfish and we don't want to pay taxes?
I have to take issue with the question. In the last provincial election, nobody was promising big tax cuts. And again, in the lead up to last year's budget, I heard nobody clamoring for big tax cuts. So I would actually say that this isn't the public's priority. When the government did cut income taxes in its last budget and then had the gall to call it a housing budget, I think that was simply them being deeply ideological, choosing over the wishes of the public to bring in a tax cut because they simply believe in shrinking government and taking options off the table, and so that there's less money available to do things that we need.
Can you explain very briefly why is it not a good idea to put into debt reduction? Because a lot of people say, well, we're paying on interest rates almost as much as we're paying on welfare. Right, yeah. 2.2 billion or something as compared to welfare, which is 2.8 billion. So if we're paying so much money when we do this debt reduction, yeah, isn't it beneficial in the long run?
Not through debt repayment in particular. Actually, British Columbia's fiscal position is pretty good, pretty enviable. Our debt is the second lowest in the country after Alberta, which is in a very unique position.
We're paying a lot of money for it.
Well, we're paying about 7 cents on every tax dollar. And if anyone out there who's carrying a mortgage on their house, if they were only paying 7% of their income on their mortgage payments, I suspect they'd be pretty happy. Mm-hmm. But mostly what economists are interested in is what's happening to your debt to GDP ratio, meaning the ratio of your overall debt relative to our income. And as long as that's going on a downward track, then over time, less and less of our tax dollars go into debt repayment or into interest payments. And in fact, the debt to GDP ratio has been going down at a very steady clip. And even if the government did what the CCPA has long said, which is stop making debt repayments and just spend the money on the programs that we need, the debt to GDP ratio would still be going down.
Why is it go down? I don't quite understand the mechanics of it. That you're claiming that if they were not to pay it, but rather spend that money in social services, then the debt would be reduced. How is it reduced without paying?
The debt to GDP ratio is reduced because it's
not the debt itself.
Not the debt. Let me give you an example. When Canada came out of World War II, we had a huge debt to GDP ratio, about 100%, meaning the size of our debt relative to the size of our economy was almost exactly even. Over the next 30 years, the debt to GDP ratio shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until it was very minimal. Mm-hmm. It did so without ever making any debt repayment. It did so simply because over time, when your economy is growing, mm-hmm, if your debt is stable, mm-hmm, the debt to GDP ratio shrinks.
Let's talk about welfare for a minute. Yeah. We have a question on nowpolling.ca about guaranteed basic income. Mm-hmm. And something like 45% of people would like to have a universal basic income. Mm-hmm. And another 40% or so want a qualified according to income or according to need basic income. Is that something that CCPA would advocate for or propose as a solution for poverty?
I think we should. I think that should be part of the debate, and we are actually doing a research paper on the guaranteed annual income right now. But any way you cut it, whether or not it takes the form of a guaranteed annual income or whether it takes the form of welfare rates that are actually adequate and accessible, the point is that any part of a meaningful anti-poverty strategy has to have income transfers that take people out of poverty.
What do you propose for mental illness? Like, we have a lot of people on the street and basically they're mentally ill. What is the CCPA solution to that problem?
Well, that too is part of an anti-poverty strategy, is a comprehensive mental health plan with a high emphasis on community mental health. Because part of the problem is, and this is true in healthcare in general, but especially in mental health, is we've tightened the acute care system, and in the case of mental health, we've shrunk the traditional institutional places where people with mental illnesses used to go, which is probably a good thing. But we never made the commensurate investment at the community level, where there's community services. A big piece of it is supportive housing. So it's very tied in with the housing stuff. We need an increase in social housing in general, but in particular a huge build out in what's called supportive housing, where people have access to services and mental health services.
So in housing, the government has been putting millions of dollars to buy out some hotels and all that. You think that is a good step on the right direction, or?
Well, I think they needed to do that because there's a risk. There was a risk, and there remains a continuing risk that a lot of low-income housing is going to get converted into, either tourist housing or higher-end housing. So I'm glad that the government did that, but it's simply a stopgap. It's simply a way of maintaining some of the existing stock of low-income housing, and hopefully doing some maintenance on it, which has been long overdue. But it doesn't actually increase the stock of low-income housing, which is the more significant thing that has to happen. Last week, the provincial government announced another big homelessness announcement, but it was all on emergency shelters. And for some pig-headed reason, they will not ante up money for actual housing, despite the fact that the money is there. And this is why we emphasize the surplus stuff that we do. I think the public desperately wants action on this. And yet they feel forlorn, right? And they think that, it's too expensive, nothing can be done. In fact, if you look at what the Olympic Housing Committee has recommended, and they've said that if you wanted to make a huge difference in Vancouver in the lead up to the Olympics, we need 3,200 units. And building that many units would cost $640 million. It's a lot of money, but it's a fraction of last year's $4 billion surplus. And so the government could move on this, but they just won't.
There's a problem sometimes when the poor are ghettoed into a hotel and to a project. As you know, in the States, they had a lot of those problems because of ghettoing of the poor. So I thought here in Canada we had a better solution, which is co-op housing. For about 30% of your income. Doesn't matter whether you're a dentist or you're a bus driver or whatever your income is, you would get accommodation. We don't have that anymore. You think that would be a better long-term solution rather than just because of the Olympics buy this hotel and the other hotel?
Yeah, well, as I say, I think the strategy of buying the hotels is a stopgap to prevent conversion. But when it comes to building new units, it should take different forms. It should be spread out all over the Lower Mainland. And if it can be done as mixed housing, we know that mixed income communities are the most is the healthiest way of doing it.
Another issue with social needs is transportation. And we have on nowpolling.ca, one of the questions is, should we abolish the fare box, the fares from transit? And the majority of people, I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but something like 60 or 70% of people would like that. Of course, that's a TransLink issue, but I think that would perhaps help the poor as well, if you had that service without having to worry about your bus fare.
Yeah.
Do you
well,
think
and
that?
we have also published a little paper looking at what would happen to increased use if fares were lower. We didn't model the complete elimination of fares, but we did model reducing fares significantly. I think ultimately we're needing a huge infusion of public dollars into a transportation system. There's two things that prevent people from using it. If you're low income, it's the cost. If you're upper or middle income, it's the lack of convenient access and capacity. So you need, for environmental reasons, we need both. We need to see a significant build out in just the frequency and availability and convenience of public transportation, and we need those. It has to be financially an incentive to really get out of your car and into the bus.
Well, having it for free would be the best financial incentive, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a balance because you want to make sure that there is enough income to build out the system as it is, and I don't know is the short answer. I think they should be lower than they are. Whether or not they should be completely free,
How much lower?
I don't know.
Okay.
But they should be lower, but mainly because if they were completely free, that's a benefit as well to people who can actually afford it. And so I think with all of these things, you're trying to design a system that has the most progressivity to it, which asks people who can afford it to pay more, and that those who can't afford it to pay less. So it's a balance to try to figure out how to structure that.
But we don't do that with sidewalks. They're paid by taxes.
Right.
And we don't say those who can afford it should pay maybe 10 cents a block or something.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Anyway, another point you mentioned there is environmental initiatives. And what exactly do you have in mind that the government should do for environmental initiatives?
Well, when we went to the Finance Committee, I guess our main objective was this. We're heartened by the fact that the government is finally getting serious about climate change and wants to move forward with a bold plan. And there's going to be many, many policy instruments for getting there, some of them in the budget, some of them are just regulatory. Our concern is that this government has a blind spot when it comes to inequality. And with many environmental measures that one can think of, they actually are, in and of themselves, their impact would be regressive, meaning that they would impact lower income individuals greater than upper income individuals. So one example of that would be a carbon tax, a tax based on fossil fuel emissions, basically.
What should the BC government do about addictions? I know the municipal government is doing something with the federal. What do you propose the BC government do about addictions?
I'm not an expert in the area, but certainly you hear that people aren't able to get treatment when they're ready for treatment. But our take overall is that whatever it is, it needs to be ambitious and bold. And part of an overall anti-poverty strategy that deals with welfare and income and housing and childcare and addictions and mental health and the minimum wage all together. The main thing that we were really calling for that kind of think captures all of that is we would like to see the BC government do what the government of Quebec has done, what the Conservative government of Danny Williams in Newfoundland has done, what Ontario now says they're going to do, and what Nova Scotia has just said they want to do, which is have an overall anti-poverty strategy with clear targets and clear timelines. You know, this government that we have now is keen on targets and timelines. The Premier is bringing in targets and timelines for climate change. That's good, because he knows that nothing gets done if you don't have clear targets and timelines, and that's how governments are accountable in terms of meeting those. So our real desire is, if timelines and targets are how you show that something's important, then let's have an anti-poverty strategy with targets and timelines, and that will then be an overall umbrella for us to then figure out how to meet those through all of these other measures.
Mm-hmm. Well, Seth Klein, thank you very much. Is there something that we missed?
No, I think that's good.